pagrarally ng mga grupong pabor sa impeachment ni Chief Justice Hilario David at ang mga grupong pumapit. Ayon naman sa National Security Advisor na si Mr. Royal Roland, ang mass action ng mga anti-David ay bahagi ng planong data with decision.
Pangako ko sa sarili na kapag nakalaya si Danill,
In literature, the word contemporary occupies a significantly different meaning compared to its denotative counterpart. When we speak of the contemporary period, with regards to the arts, especially the art of literature, we speak of every literary shift and characteristic that came into fruition and emerged from the second half of the 20th century or from the end of the Second World War hitherto or up to the current day. After the Philippines was liberated from the sanguineous shackles of the Japanese occupation in the 1940s, a seismic shift was felt all throughout the country, such as reflected in the literature produced at the time, or the literature of the genesis of the contemporary period. Unlike the predominantly Tagalog literature made during the Japanese period following the ban of any English literature being produced, and in direct contrast, the English-dominated, American-influenced works made during the American period, the arrival of the Philippines into the contemporary world, into the newfound liberty following America's signing of the Treaty of Manila in 1946, granting the Philippines independence, Filipino writers were no longer restricted within the confines tailored by their colonizers, but rather made to make do with everything they have experienced and learned after countless years of being subjected to such confinement. During the late 1940s, Philippine literature was still stained by the colors of war and conflict. This is seen in novels such as Without Seeing Dawn, published in 1947 by Esteban Javellana, and Watch in the Night, published in 1953 by Alberto Tiempo. Much of the literature published during the post-war era was written in English and by authors who got their education from the United States of America or England. It wasn't until the 1960s that a resurgence of Tagalog literature in the Philippines was seen, especially in poetry. According to Elizabeth Mohn in EBSCO in 2023, from the 1960s to the 1980s, Tagalog poets generated a great deal of work, including works in which they confronted political and social upheaval of the time, including the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, who ran the country as either president or dictator from 1965 until 1986. This is seen in works such as Maikling Kata ng 20 Pangunahing Autor, published in 1962 by A.G. Abadia and Ponciano E.P. Pineda. Aside from the resurgence of Tagalog as the dominant language in Philippine literature, umusbong rin ang mga tema ukol sa aktivismo na siyang naging bunga ng pasistang pamumuno ni Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Upon the declaration of martial law in 1972, it was no longer a colonizer who had their foot on the necks of Filipino freedom, but rather the newly independent country's very own leader. The declaration of martial law in 1972 was but a precursor to numerous other forms of physical and intellectual violence which rippled all through the skin of what it meant to be a Filipino at the time. Most especially an activist Filipino writer who felt the effects of the violence of the fascism firsthand and critiqued it. Censorship through the closure of media establishments such as Manila Times and the Daily Mirror, slaughtering of individuals who protested and wailed for freedom, and the unjust jailing and chastising of those who chose to outwardly speak against Marcos' fascist regime meant that Filipino literature would not only radicalize, but revolutionize and change, impermeably and forever. Notable literary works written and published during this time are Dekada 70 by Lualhati Bautista and Prometheus Unbound by Jose F. Lacaba. Succeeding this, by the end of the 20th century, modern ideas and cultural forces emerging in the West, such as feminism, had also influenced Philippine literature. Citing the same body of work by Elizabeth Mohn, she states that such changes also forced a cultural change in the Philippines, in which readers began to read more works, even those from the past, of female writers. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was also a continued focus on writing that told about real life, as well as writing about magic and magical realism. Onwards to the present, such changes are still felt and are being written about by the Filipino writers of our day. Though it is worth noting that from the late 2010s to now, the popularity of short stories and bubblegum pop fiction books and the advent of technology and e-publication applications have taken their toll on modern-day Philippine literature. So much so that it has become the poster child of current-day Filipino writing, often occupying the most space in the shelves of bookstores allotted for Filipino literature, elucidating a modern plunge into more rudimentary and lighthearted subject matters such as romance, drama, and relationship dynamics. So what exactly is the contemporary period of Philippine literature? How do we begin to define it? In order to fully fathom the nuances of contemporary Philippine literature, we must begin with the dawn of freedom. So our journey into contemporary Philippine literature begins on July 4, 1946 with the signing of the Treaty of Manila. While this marked our formal independence from the United States after the occupation of Japan, it also sparked a deep crisis of identity. Sa madaling salita, malaya na tayo sa papel. Pero ang tanong ng mga manunulat noon ay, sino na tayo ngayon? Literature during this immediate post-war period was a struggle between two worlds. On one side, we had writers influenced by American New Criticism, which focused on the technical beauty of the text. On the other side, we had a growing need to write about the Filipino soul. N.V.M. Gonzalez, in his classic novel The Bamboo Dancers, published in 1959, captured this perfectly. He showcased the displaced Filipino, educated and westernized, yet feeling like a stranger in his own land. This period taught us that independence is not just about a treaty. It is about reclaiming our story from the shadows of our colonizers and those who sought to oppress us. As we moved into the 1960s, the defining characteristic of the contemporary period of Philippine literature became more introspective. The legendary Nick Joaquin provided one of the most important works of his era, The Woman Who Had Two Navels, published in 1961. In this book, Joaquin explored the double identity of the Filipino, part Spanish Catholic heritage, and the part American modern influence. Pinapakita ni Joaquin na ang pagkatao ng Pilipino ay parang isang puzzle na may mga pirasong galing sa iba't ibang mananakop. He famously argued that we should not reject our colonial past, but rather digest it to become something new. His work set the stage for contemporary writers to stop apologizing for their complex history and start using it as a source of strength. This was a time when the Filipino writer began to act as a historian of the heart. Onwards from this, contemporary literature had transformed into the literature of commitment during the martial law years. We cannot talk about the evolution of our literature without discussing the dark years of the martial law. This period forced a shift from art for art's sake to what we call social realism, or the literature of commitment. Writers became the voice of the voiceless. Hindi na sapat ang magsulat tungkol sa pag-ibig o sa ganda ng kalikasan. Kailangang sumigaw ang panulat laban sa kawalan ng katarungan. As I said earlier, Lualhati Bautista is the definitive voice of this era. Her previously cited novel, Dekada serves as a factual and emotional record of a Filipino family's struggle during the dictatorship. Through the character of Amanda Bartolome, Bautista showed how the political becomes personal. She wrote, "Ang bawat tao ay may kanya-kanyang kwento ng pagtitiis. Pero ang mahalaga ay kung paano natin ito gagawing kwento ng tagumpay." This sentiment defined the contemporary spirit of the time, the belief that literature is a weapon for truth-telling. During these years, underground publications like Ulos, flourished, proving that you can silence a person, but you cannot silence a story. Succeeding this is the post-EDSA, or the explosion of pluralism, which would come to define what contemporary Filipino literature would be. When the 1986 EDSA revolution happened, the dam of censorship finally broke. This led to what scholars like Bienvenido Lumbera call a plurality of voices. Biglang nagkaroon ng puwang para sa lahat. Mga babae, mga miyembro ng LGBTQIA+, at ang mga manunulat mula sa iba't ibang rehiyon. The contemporary period from the late 80s to the 2000s saw the rise of marginalized voices. Danill Garcia and Danton Remoto edited Lualhati in 1993, the first anthology of Philippine gay writing. This was a massive milestone. It signaled that Philippine literature was no longer just about the heroic man or the suffering mother. It was about every Filipino, regardless of who they loved or how they identified. We started to realize during this time that our national narrative is actually a collection of many different smaller narratives. Then came the global Filipino and the digital turn. In the last 20 years, our literature has expanded even further due to the OFW phenomenon and the internet. We now have transnational literature, stories written by Filipinos in the diaspora who are still deeply connected to home. Writers like Merlinda Bobis and Miguel Sihuko have brought the Filipino experience to the world stage. In Sihuko's Ilustrado, in 2008, he uses a modern style involving blogs and news snippets to talk about Philippine politics. Dito natin makikita na ang panitikan ay hindi na lang nakakulong sa mga libro sa library. Come the advent of technology, nasa screen na rin ito ng ating mga cellphone. The rise of speculative fiction and graphic novels is also a key characteristic in defining the contemporary period of Philippine literature. So why exactly do we write this way? It all boils down to the Filipino experience. What really makes our contemporary literature different? What demarcates it from the contemporary literature existing in every other place on the planet? The answer to that is the fact that our contemporary literature is built on a palimpsest, a surface where the old writing is erased but still visible underneath. Our writers are constantly negotiating between our indigenous roots, the myths and oral traditions of our ancestors pre-colonial, our colonial trauma, the scars left by Spain, America, and Japan, and our modern reality, the chaos of traffic, the struggle of poverty, and the hope of democracy in the face of corruption and political unfairness. Ang bawat tula at nobela na sinusulat natin ngayon ay may bakas ng lahat ng ito. We write because we need to make sense of a world that is often confusing and unfair. Our literature is our way of saying, we are still here. In summary, the contemporary period of Philippine literature exists not merely as a timeline of struggles, of colonialism, of post-war plights, but as a deliberate evolution of form and purpose. The period, which traces its roots back to the signing of the 1946 Treaty of Manila, marks a definitive shift from the American era's focus on imitation and strict Western craft toward a more experimental and inclusive style. It also allowed Filipino writers to deviate far from the oppressive restraints of the Japanese occupation, which banned English as a medium of literature, overall emphasizing how, in the contemporary world, Filipino writers have a lot more freedom and liberty, not only when it comes to the language they use in the literature they create, but also the topics and the themes in which they wish to write about. Dito na nagsimulang bumalasubas ang ating mga manunulat sa mga lumang patakaran upang hanapin ang tunay na boses ng Pilipino. The contemporary period of Philippine literature is defined by, as Bienvenido Lumbera describes it, a plurality of voices. This era brings marginalized groups like the LGBTQIA plus community and indigenous people to the center, while a strong sense of regionalism decenters Manila by celebrating works written in mother tongues. Moreover, in the contemporary Philippine world of literature, we see the rise of genre hybridity, wherein myths and modern life collide in speculative fiction and graphic novels, alongside historiographic metafiction, which uses storytelling to question and re-examine our official history. Moreover, the diaspora narrative has also become a pillar of the contemporary period. It captures the displacement and resilience of millions of Filipinos working abroad as they search for a better life in different countries. Hindi na rin tayo takot sa linguistic fluidity o ang paggamit ng Taglish at wikang kanto sa ating mga seryosong akda. This reflects a move toward authenticity rather than academic perfection. Despite these experimental forms, a deep social commitment remains in the literature we have today, ensuring that literature continues to act as a witness to our nation's political and social struggles. Despite the rising popularity of bubblegum and pop fiction books, this still does exist in our world today. And by breaking away from the strict constraints of the past, the colonial constraints of the past even, we have built a literary tradition for ourselves that is as complex, that is as diverse as our own history as Filipinos. Therefore, the most definitive characteristic of contemporary Filipino literature is that it shows how we are marbled by the nuances which make us chiefly and uniquely Filipino.
Kilala kami sa aming komunidad dahil sa aming apelyido. Sa telephone directory, tatatlo lang ang nakalista na kaapelyido namin. Ako ang panganay at pinakamahina raw ang ulo sa magkakapatid. Nagtapos ako ng home economics. Ako si Yolanda, Filipinas.
Now that we have laid down our foundation for understanding the contemporary period of Philippine literature, let's begin to look at and critique a body of work released within it. Specifically, the movie Filipinas, released in 2003, directed by Joel Lamangan. The film opens up with the voice of the main character, who will serve as the vessel through which we will see everything that will unfold within the film's 1 hour and 43-minute runtime. That is to say that the narrative of the film is presented mostly in a first-person perspective, through the eyes of none other than Yolanda Filipinas, also referred to as Yoli. In the film's exposition, we are introduced to numerous characters, most notable being Florencia Filipinas, the mother and the matriarch of the family, following the death of her husband. Also, Kathleen Filipinas, the daughter of Samuel Filipinas and the granddaughter of Florencia. As the film continues running, little by little, we are introduced to the entire family. Vicky Filipinas, the one running the family business of selling onions, who is also soon to be married to Ramesh in the exposition of the film. Samuel Filipinas, the divorcee, the OFW from America, and the father of Kathleen.
Kasalanan ko ba kung ganito ang boses ko?
Eman Filipinas, the activist, proudly fronting for the group KMU.
Kinokondena ng kilusan lahat ng uri ng terorismo.
Gloria Filipinas, the caretaker, the one with the nursing degree, the OFW from Israel who is married to Greg.
Sinabi ko.
Huwag naman natin gamitin ang diskusyong ito para isingit ang ating mga personal na sentimiento.
Bakit?
Narciso Filipinas, the youngest, and the soldier.
Ay, so ako, Nay. Kailangan pa ako sa
bakit naman?
Yellow alert to kami.
Other notable characters introduced around the exposition of the film are Diana, ang anak-anak ni Florencia, Poldo, the father of Diana,
Palayain ang mga inaapi!
Dindo, Yolanda's former love interest, and Samuel's other children whom he took with him to America in leaving Kathleen behind. All bearing the name Filipinas, all drawn from different parts of the world in different parts of life, coming home to stay under the same house. The inciting incident of the story is when all Florencia's children converge underneath a common roof, and Yolanda begins to fathom and perceive how dysfunctional their family truly is.
Kung si nanay din lang magde-decide para sa atin.
Pwede ba ang pag-usapan natin kung anong magagawa natin?
Eh, ayaw nga ibenta eh. Do you have any bright ideas?
Wala. Eh, ikaw lang naman na may bright ideas eh.
Ano bang sinabi ko?
Huwag naman natin gamitin ang diskusyong ito para isingit ang ating mga personal na sentimiento.
Bakit? Eh, totoo naman ang sinasabi ko ah. Sa ating lahat dito, sino ba ang pinakamatalino? Hindi ba si Samuel lang?
Sandali. Nag-uusap lang naman tayo dito, di ba?
Yun nga sana ang gusto kong mangyari.
Hindi ba't yun naman ang ginagawa natin?
Teka, pwede ako muna magsalita?
Eh kung pagbotohan na lang kaya natin.
Basta ang alam ko, isang tao lang dito malakas ang boses.
Teka, ako
Bakit?
muna!
Kasalanan ko ba ako ganito ang boses ko?
Pwede ba itigil nyo yan? Para kayong hindi magkakapatid!
Sa ibang araw na lang natin pag-usapan to. Total, lahat tayo dito dakdak ng dakdak, wala nakikinig.
We later are born witness to Samuel's authoritarianism and see how his anger and his desire to be followed becomes a pungent, constant threat hovering over the pulse of the family.
Bumalik lang si Samuel, nagkaroon na ng bagong boss ang bahay. Dahil siya ang pinakamaunlad sa amin, nagagawa niyang sapawan ng lahat. Hindi na lang namin ipinagpatuloy ang pag-uusap tungkol sa lupa. Hinarap na lang namin ang tiyak na pagkalugi, imbes mawala pa ang natitirang pag-aari.
In their completeness, the Filipinas family is fragmented and far apart from each other, riddled with clandestine animosities and a common refusal to comprehend each other's situations and ideas. As we follow Yolanda, we learn that she feels as though Florencia doesn't truly see her, a motif that we will see all throughout the film. She feels as though she is a pillar, born to bear the weight of others, all the while they fail to perceive her purpose despite how integral it is. She expresses this to Florencia, and it is seen all throughout the film how Yolanda, despite being the eldest, feels the farthest from the family.
Nay, hindi niyo naman ako nakikita, diba? Lagi nga tayong magkasama pero hindi niyo ako nakikita. Hindi niyo rin ako naririnig.
Yolanda, kailangan kita. Mahalaga ka sa akin. Tandaan mo yan.
Upon the return of Gloria, following her leaving of Israel in pursuit of making good on her promise to Vicky to be there at her wedding, and the death of her friend during a bombing in Israel, Yolanda's erstwhile ache emerges. She expresses how, although they had a rare and tenacious bond in the past, Gloria's indifference towards Yolanda's sacrifices and efforts with regards to her and Greg, efforts which were not reciprocated by Gloria in Yolanda's case of having to cover up for Dindo. Yolanda's sacrifices made her feel as though her efforts were taken for granted. And from this confrontation, the motif of Yolanda's feeling of abandonment comes forward in the plot and is established, explicitly showing us how she feels the contemporary departure of her siblings was a form of betrayal against her, isolating her in a life she didn't choose, forcibly accepting burdens she never desired, all while her siblings paved themselves a life they had agency in, something Yolanda never had, but always desired.
Ginawa ko lahat yun para sa'yo. Dahil ayoko maramdaman mo kung anong naramdaman ko. Anong ginawa mo? Di ba umalis ka? Hindi ka nagpaalam? Nurse ka, dapat ikaw na nag-aalaga sa nanay natin, di ba? Anong ginawa niyo lahat? Lahat kayo, iniwan niyo ako mag-isa.
Oras, gumagalaw. Mga buwan, lumalagas. And throughout the passage of time in this narrative, more pangs from the past, not only Yolanda's, start coming to light. the unresolved unraveling, the more time the members of the Filipinas family spent together. All the while that unfurls, Yolanda ends up searching for Dindo, the man she truly loved. The same man she betrayed in the name of her family for the sake of Samuel securing a trip to America, an immigration to America rather. In her finding of him, she seeks reconciliation and reconnection, but her offer of togetherness was only met by the bite of reality. The life Dindo built in her absence, as well as the woman he was soon to marry, once again reminding her that she is too late, that she cannot have what she had desired and had deserved in the past.
Bumibisita siya ron eh. Yung matanda kanina, na nakita mo, yun ang tatay niya.
Imbitahin kaya natin siya sa kasal natin next month.
Kailangan ko nang umalis. Salamat.
Later in the evening, Poldo confronts Diana, whom he caught dancing with her friends late in the evening, around midnight. Something he strongly disagreed with. And in this, we see how Poldo truly feels about the family they're currently living with. And in his anger, we see the subject of class and economic disparity affecting how we treat those around us. For Poldo believes that despite the Filipinas family's kindness towards them, it is all conditional, it is all transactional, and they treat his family as individuals who are beneath them. The altercation between Poldo and his daughter escalates, causing Diana to flee to the main house where the family of Filipinas was sleeping soundly and woken up from the fighting. Samuel and Eman began breaking the fight apart, causing Poldo to turn his back on not only the family of Filipinas, but his very own as well. In the process, delivering one of the strongest lines in the film, and the springboard bringing us to the narrative's rising action.
Palamunin ka lang dito!
Poldo, umalis ka na. Ayaw namin ng gulo dito sa bahay, ah.
Bakit ang pamilya niyo mayos?
Umalis ka na!
Oh! Sige!
The rising action occurs a few days before Christmas Eve, where Samuel gathers together with Florencia and his children, and reluctantly ends up admitting to his mother and his children that being an overseas worker in America isn't as saccharine, as convenient, as lucrative as it sounds on paper. He confesses to them that he is financially incapable of bringing Kathleen and his children back to America like he had promised. Succeeding this sudden confession from Samuel, in the midst of the bliss of the Filipinas family's Christmas Eve celebration, Poldo rallies outside their home in demand of them bringing his family back to him. Throwing a torch to the straw display stood outside their family's home after declining Eman's invitation to come inside and spend the evening with them. Through this, a motif is established. The motif of rejection towards invitations made under the intention of bringing people together, of bringing upon forgiveness. This is seen not only in the members of the Filipinas family, but, as I just stated, in other characters as well, such as Poldo. In other words, the rising action is but a symbol of how, in times where glee is meant to sheath a home, a family, nilulusaw lamang ang kaligayahan ng pamilyang Filipinas ng mga gulong umaalingaw-ngaw sa kanilang paligid. Ang pinakamasaklap roon ay ang katotohanan na karamihan ng gulong iyon ay dulot ng kanilang pagsama-sama, and more so, their persistent unwillingness to hear each other out and understand each other. This complication is followed by another. After Samuel learns that his son, Dylan, accompanied Eman to a rally, in response to finding this out, he confronts his son, expressing how he could have gotten hurt during the rally. But then, Samuel's parental concern grew into intimidation when Eman butted in and defended Dylan. Samuel's intimidation and Eman's refusal to bend to his way of thinking makes the shattering in the family's foundation glisten, turning every former flaw to something apparent and impossible to deny. In Florencia's devastation upon witnessing the altercation, she shouts,
Tumigil na kayong dalawa! Tumigil na kayo! Umalis na kayo rito! Mas gusto ko pa mamatay na ako!
A sharp foreshadowing stinging the story in moments where it's most bare. Not long after, hardships met and ceaselessly built on the already weakening walls of the family as Vicky's business continues its plunge south. In the height of all complications, the sudden death of Narciso in battle. As the year inched towards ending, it seemed as though walang balak tumigil ang tadhana ng pagbuhos ng problema sa direksyon ng pamilyang Filipinas. During Narciso's burial, when the narrative is on the cusp of its climax, Eman brings a group of individuals from his activist group to hold together a banner that read, "Stop State Terrorism." In his belief that the military was behind Narciso's death, the act of protestation later led to a fight between Samuel and Eman. The fight ended up being the climax and the final blow that would send the family to its knees. The fight exacerbates physically as their perceptions fail to hear one another. Blinded by the inconsolable want to silence one another, Samuel and Eman accidentally knock Florencia onto the tile floor, knocking her unconscious as a result of trying to break the fight apart. The aftermath of the fall is the falling action, where Florencia is comatose, and the damage done to her being announced irreparable. And in a sad case of tardy timing, only then do Samuel and Eman lay their differences down to the ground. Only then do the members of the family see each other and come together, not only physically, but emotionally as well. Following this, in the narrative's denouement, things begin going back to the way they once were, but with subtle changes, necessary changes, missing from the life they lived before. In the series of losses, those left to live within the Filipinas household finally found a way to be a family. Not a fragmented collection of individuals forced to be in the same household because of blood relations. Not a collection of people who were deeply corroded by the past. And in the end, Yoli said it herself.
Ay, ate, oo nga pala.
Tama ang sabi ng nanay. Hindi natin dapat pinapasa ng nakaraan ng parang krus. Dapat daw ay laging ginagamit natin ang nakaraan na tuntungan para maabot ang kinabukasan.
Moreover, Filipinas is riddled with symbols that are hard to perceive. The first symbol being Yolanda's silence and distance. In arguments and fights, despite being the eldest, Yolanda often keeps to herself and only ever speaks when she's asked to or when she feels that it is absolutely necessary. The second symbol, then, from the film Filipinas is Samuel's belligerent condemnation of Eman's activism, which could potentially embody or represent the ubiquity of the demonization of activism across the Philippines, a residue left behind by Marcos' dictatorship. The third symbol is the nature of their family. The entire dynamic of having children who come from different countries and various walks of life embody and explain why their ideations often contrast and try to overpower one another. This is to say that the different children symbolize the different eras the Philippines encountered in the past. The differences of Florencia's children represent, compound, and come together to represent the difficulties felt by the Philippines in the face of colonization, and their fragmentedness as a family due to said disparities and socio-economic trouble is but a symbol of how fragmented the Filipino identity is if we continue to detest and carry with us with much shame the marks left behind by our colonizers. Overall, the film Filipinas is a kaleidoscopic looking glass into what it means to be a Filipino in the contemporary world. It takes on numerous subject matters such as activism, politics, family dynamics, and the struggles of overseas workers. Yet, in this field of symbols and subjects, the film carries one singular theme, and it is that we mustn't allow the unresolved pains of what has passed to persist and corrode the foundation of family.